I'm Mary Jo Bane. I'm on the faculty at the Harvard Kennedy School, and I will be chairing this panel. So one of the most significant contributions of the book, The Truly Disadvantaged, was in the attention that it paid to family structure and family dynamics. And it seemed to me it did two things that were really important. One is that it what we might say, lifted the curse of Pat Moynihan. After Pat Moynihan wrote his somewhat infamous book on black family structure and employment, the reaction to that, there was so much controversy that for many years, scholars did not look at that set of issues. But with The Truly Disadvantaged, Bill Wilson's extremely careful analysis and presentation of both the theory and the data drew attention again to the ways in which family dynamics, family structure are related to overall economic issues and especially to joblessness. And that attention and Bill's hypothesis, especially the hypothesis of the marriageable men pool, kind of straightforward idea. If you want to have stable families, men marry women, and women don't like to marry men who are either in jail or unemployed. Putting together the economic structures with the family structures generated a whole lot of research to try to understand how those things work, what implications they have, and how that has affected trends in the future. So that's what this panel is about. And what we will be exploring today is kind of bringing forward that work to the present as the other panels have done. Every member on this panel, like most of the people on the panels today, have some kind of connection to Bill Wilson's work, and I suspect they will tell that about them themselves. But they range from Kathy Edin, who was a 12-year-old graduate student when she first read The Truly Disadvantaged and started her off on her work, and Sandy Jencks, who was a mature journalist who wrote a review of The Truly Disadvantaged, and David and I, who were working on a set of related issues and both inspired and challenged by Bill's work. So our panel is an all-Harvard panel, which makes it easy to introduce. We will start off with David Ellwood, who is the current dean of the Kennedy School, followed by Sandy Christopher Jencks, who is a professor, and Kathy Edin, also a professor.
I like the sound of that current. It suggests it's not permanent, so that's always a good thing. I want to start where Mary Jo started. This is not surprising since Mary Jo and I have been collaborators in various crimes over the years, that she would start where I wanted to. But I remember vividly when I was a very young assistant professor, this was 2 or 3 years ago, and Pat Moynihan did come to the Kennedy School. And Mary Jo and I had actually been working on some family structure stuff and other things. And there was a small reception for him, and I came up to him in one of our rooms, and I said to him, Senator Moynihan, I thought that report you wrote on the black family and in the future and so forth was really important and really had a lot of insights in it. And he looked at me with the most suspicious eyes you could imagine. My beard, surprisingly, was darker then, longer, bushier, and so forth. And through his teeth, he said, "It took me 10 years to get over that report." And he walked away. And I, of course, was serious. But it did illustrate just how dangerous and how treacherous. And obviously, there were many things in the Moynihan report that were wrong, and there were many things that were objectionable in the way they were framed. But what Bill Wilson did for that issue, but also for a whole series of others, another example which was controversial, remains controversial to this day, was the use of the word underclass and thinking about what that really means and so forth. He not only made that a topic that was acceptable and indeed important to reflect on and think about and deal with, he actually put academic rigor and frames and substance around these issues with strong, compelling hypotheses and data that made it not only possible, but indeed made it essential for people who cared, who have read books of that book and other work of Bill's, to say, gee, that's amazing, that makes sense. And they were very compelling hypotheses. Not all are borne out. Not all of us agree on each of them and where they've all headed. But for me personally, Bill, your work and the work of your colleagues unambiguously affected my trajectory more than probably any single human being. And I'm at least better for that. I'm not sure the Kennedy School is at this stage, but there you go. So that's first simple point. And over again, Bill Wilson is set the stage, asked the question, provide the provocative but very, very scholarly and scientific framing of an issue that set not only sociology, but a whole group of social scientists broadly interested in inequality off in new and exciting directions. And that continues to this day, and we're very, very grateful for that. I'll come back to policy as well, because, of course, Bill has always been, his work has always been both approachable for people that are engaged in public policy or people that are connected with people that engage in public policy, but also sought out, quite actively sought out by people in authority and whatever. Next, I want to focus on family itself and the family structure. And one of the most important parts of the Truly Disadvantaged, as all you know, is indeed its focus on family, its discussion particularly of out-of-wedlock childbearing, its discussion about the declines of marriage, and most importantly, the male marriageable pool hypothesis, which Bill had been working with for a number of years with various colleagues, some of you. And the idea was unbelievably straightforward and very compelling. You know, everyone knew that families were changing pretty rapidly, although they may not have realized just how much and how fast. But the notion that a huge part of the story might well revolve around the fact that men were unemployed or out of the market entirely in terms of being in prison or having been in prison, that's a very straightforward and easy to tell story. It's very hard to get married to someone who's in prison. It's very unappealing to marry someone who will actually be a drain on the finances rather than a part of mutual support. And so and there were many other hypotheses out there that frankly didn't work. Mary Jo and I had done a variety of work on welfare and found it really didn't explain very much of what was going on. And by the way, if you've had a recent test of that, we've not only ended welfare as we know it, near as I can tell, we've ended welfare, and the problem has not gotten better. So that's sort of put to rest. But so I and others, Mary Jo often, but others as well, tried to look at the male marriageable pool hypothesis. And here's the thing. As compelling as it sounded, it was actually hard to demonstrate that it was really driving things. I know Sandy will talk a little bit about that as well. You know, I'm an economist, and as a result of that, I have many failings. But part of that is what we economists tend to do is look at the margins. So, okay, say, gee, if that's true, then let's look at the people that are really unemployed and what happens to them over time. And if you're unemployed a lot, are you less likely to get married and so forth? And you'd find hints here and there, and certainly the historical trends worked well. But when you really tried to scratch hard, it was hard to really establish any causal links, or at least a lot of them. And I would say further that, of course, sociologists, and this is very clear in the book too, don't say, oh, look, it's not one for one. It's a whole kind of set of culture and values and a milieu of expectations and the like. And so you wouldn't expect it. And yet, you know, to a economist who says, yeah, but it's changed over time. It's changed because you say you would expect it to change faster where there was more unemployment. It's sort of hard to make the case without doing it at the margin as well. Nonetheless, so I was feeling pretty much like my summary of social science at one point was, we are confident that families have changed, and we are confident that nothing caused them to change. And that seemed really unappealing as an explanation. And at that point, I actually sat in on a seminar with Kathy Edin, who's also on this panel. And she told the following anecdote, and if it's wrong, Kathy, just don't. This was an epiphany moment for me, so don't correct it too harshly. But, you know, following much of the kind of ideas and strategy that the ethnographic work of Bill, she had obviously been doing, looking at fragile families and the like, and she said, she relayed an anecdote, I guess, from Philadelphia, where she said, one of the mothers came to her and said, you know, maybe someday, you know, we black moms should be like you white girls. You know, you guys are so selfish. You're not going to have a baby until everything is just perfect. You got to have the right man, the right income. Your job's got to be just so and so forth. That is so selfish. And suddenly it was one of those, and I, you know, the way a lot of social scientists, at least I, had been looking at it is try to say, okay, think about it. Do you get married, not married? And then if you're married, do you have kids? And if you're unmarried, do you have kids? And thinking of it that way. And it was all backwards. The first question is, do you want kids and when do you want to have them? And then the second question is, where does marriage fit into that? And when you work it backwards that way, or actually forward, I mean, having a kid's a much bigger deal at some level than getting married. You start asking, okay, what determines when people have children? What affects that? And what's, you know, you might say, well, why? And then you look and see a couple of obvious facts. It turns out that, yes, people are delaying childbearing, and yes, they're delaying marriage. Everyone knows that. And again, I'm sorry, I'm 10 years out of date. That's what happens when you're a dean. Your brain turns to mush and you collect no new information. But that's true. But what's interesting is among black families, there has been very little delay in childbearing. There's less of it, but the timing is not very changed, whereas marriage is way delayed. Whereas in white families, marriage is delayed slightly more than childbearing has been delayed. And that, by the way, is even more prominent if you look across education or test scores or whatever else. Huge, huge differences between dropouts and college graduates in terms of the college dropouts do not delay childbearing, they delay marriage like crazy. College educated delay childbearing like crazy and marriage like crazy. And you put those, and then you say, what is that? And that's when I think then you bring the economics back and you say, well, what would cause some women to delay childbearing and not others? And again, as many of you know, there are one straightforward set of facts, which is when you look at what happens to the wages of highly educated women, they go steeply up as they age until they have a child, and then they flatten. And if they have a child at 22, they flatten at 22. At 26, they flatten at 26. At 28, they flatten at 28, which means it's a really good plan to delay childbearing economically. It's really smart. And indeed, as we know, we have these periodic discoveries, the most recent now being by Anne-Marie Slaughter, that in fact having children does interfere with careers in ways that are inappropriate or undesirable, but real. Very, very real. And so that's right. And then if you look at low-skilled women, their wages hardly change at all. And when they have a child, they don't change. So there is no point in delaying, no economic point in delaying, if you're low-skilled or not. So it's suddenly, you could sort of say, okay, that's why low-skilled women, again, just the pure economic framework, might delay because they don't have the economic opportunities. And then where do men fit in? Well, at the ages when women, low-skilled women are having babies, the men at that stage really, really look bad. And they improve a little bit over time, so that one might be a thing. Whereas when high-skilled women are having babies, the men have aged, they've aged, and so forth. And so it's a very different story. Which sort of suggests to me, at least, the best hypothesis is a variation on the male marriageable pool. It's not just what's happening to the men, it's also what's happening to the women. And it's not just whether they're employed, it is what their futures look like. If by having children your futures are worsened, that is a very different pattern than if having children or not, your economic pattern is the same. So it is male marriageable pool, and it's really male marriageable opportunity and female opportunity associated with childbearing that ultimately ties these pieces together. And again, I think that I would regard this as a friendly amendment to Bill's ideas rather than anything else. So lastly, I just quickly want to say, what does it mean? Why should, right when Bill, I think when you were working on this bill, when you started, the fraction of children born out of wedlock was rising to about 50%, gradually getting over that. Now, as we all know, we're approaching 3/4. We're 72% or something like that.
For black.
For African Americans, I'm sorry, yes, thank you, and 35% or 40% for the overall. I don't think there's any evidence you can go back, that these things turn around short of a war. I mean, wars do get people married afterwards, but That is not a good plan as far as I'm concerned for social science. So where do we go and what do we do and how do we think about this? We'll hear from Kathy and others about what families look like now, but one of the things we do know is some stability in terms of male role models and partners is helpful, that money matters. And so I think that the most important issue here has to do with mobility, with creating futures for people. It's always been there. It's the hardest thing in the world to worry about. But if you can create a situation where less skilled people, people of color, people who are truly disadvantaged from birth even, have some sense of opportunities and futures, both for men and women, that, which is the oldest hypothesis of all in some respects, still is the greatest hope. If you create a situation where it makes sense to hold off because there are better opportunities by doing so, if it makes sense to say, gee, if I get together with this partner, male, female, whatever, that I can count on the two of us improving life together and that will be better for our children, that is a very different package than a package that says, have a kid early, have a kid late, not a great future either way, marry, don't marry, not clear I'm any better off. And it's not just marriage, obviously it's partners of the same gender, whatever else. The main point here is, I think the greatest fear I have, and reflecting on welfare reform, which I think Mary Jo will do, is welfare reform was designed, hopefully, to get more people into the labor force, which it actually did with great success. And their incomes went up a little bit, partly because of tax credits and so forth. But it was also a hope somewhere that that was the first rung of a ladder, that people would then stand up. And it's turned out to be up to a platform, a plateau, which doesn't fundamentally change things. It might get them a few dollars above the poverty line, but I've never met anybody who said, oh, thank God, a year ago I was a dollar below the poverty line, now I'm a dollar above, my life is so much better. And so that hard question would be my nominee for how we think going future. It's a very, very hard problem, but if we don't find a way to solve that issue, I don't see how we deal with the middle class problems. I don't see how we deal with other things. So Bill, help us think about mobility. Thank you very much.
Okay. I want to begin by saying a little bit about Bill, because everybody does. I didn't realize that David would say this, exactly the same thing I was going to say about Bill, but I have now tried to modify it slightly to make it dumb.
And I didn't think Mary Jo was going to say exactly the same thing.
But I would say, looking back, that there were two pivotal events in the study of the black family in the United States over the last half century. The first was the Moynihan Report in 1965, and the, I would say, venomous response of people to that report. It's difficult to appreciate how bad that was in many ways unless you go back and actually read what people wrote about both Pat and the report. And then, hold on a second. The sequel to that response was that most people who study the family are people on the left, and left of center, not very far left in most cases. And when they saw that a description of what was going on in the inner city in the United States among black families could get you branded as a racist, they ran for cover. And there were various things they did. One thing they did was to decide that they could argue that sort of all cultures are created equally, and their creators have endowed them with certain inalienable rights, and one of those rights is not to be criticized by other cultures. And another was to sort of retreat into quantitative demography, which nobody read. The third, which was by far the most common, was just to go study something else. And I must say, I think that was the most sensible reaction on many people's part. But the net result was that over the next 2 decades, research on the inner city families, I would say, produced quite a bit of heat and almost no light. The publication of The Truly Disadvantaged in 1987 really ended that dismal era, and that was a fabulous thing for scholarship and for the life of the university as well. It was sort of like the fall of the Berlin Wall 2 years later. It sent a message that the era of fear and silence and lies was over. And I think we owe Bill a huge debt for that. It was really his courage and his seriousness and his decency when you met him and talked to him that made that possible and led to an explosion of work on the family over the next 25 years. So thank you, Bill. Now let me turn to what he said about the black family. The chapter in The Truly Disadvantaged about the family, I should mention, it's a chapter co-authored with Kathryn Neckerman, who never gets much credit for her labors on this, but there she is. But I'm going to blame it on Bill and refer to it as Bill's chapter nonetheless, since I think he was the inspiration of it, although not the dog worker on all the data. The argument was that the trend was driven by rising joblessness among black fathers. And unlike a lot of the rest of the book, this was not a paradigm shift. This was exactly the argument that Moynihan had made in the Moynihan report. Bill had the sense to write it in a better way, which made it somewhat less offensive to people, but he got a lot of the same flack that Pat had gotten, but it was less intense. And I would also say that his personal gift for dealing with such criticism was somewhat greater than Pat's. Or you might say Pat's was greater in the sense that he was very good at giving as good as he got. But it did not lead to a productive discourse. What can we say about this thesis? Well, I want to tell you a story about the pitfalls of theory-driven research. Bill's hypothesis was theoretically plausible. In fact, I would go further and I'd say it was theoretically irresistible. The idea that a shortage of men who you would want to marry would lead to a decline in marriage seems sort of close to being a tautology. Not quite, but almost. And it certainly makes intuitive sense to any middle-class reader who has thought about getting married. If there's nobody you want to marry, you're less likely to get married. There are 2 possible reasons why that wouldn't work out. One is, if you want a baby and the social cost of not marrying the father is so high that you'll marry just about anyone, then you would say, okay, well, there won't be an effect of marriageability because you'll marry whoever you have to marry in order to get the baby or babies that you want. That's a stretch if you're thinking about poor women who can barely support themselves and their children anyway, that they would want to take in some guy and get married to him and then support him too. If he's not going to contribute, it's a little hard to see why that would be an attractive strategy. The other alternative is that, just a mirror image of that, maybe employment doesn't actually affect marriage, the attractiveness of marriage, as much as we think. It's hard for me to see why that would be true either. But you could imagine that as the stigma associated with having a child out of wedlock or getting divorced diminishes, the number of people who find living with an unsatisfactory husband will go up, and the number of single mothers will go up as a result, even in a scenario in which economic considerations loom very large. So, what's the problem? I would say the problem, maybe we can illustrate the problem by just putting this up right now.
Yeah, when we need him. Where's the tech guy?
Just came back.
Okay.
I just need to figure out which one I need to click here, because I will.
On the projector.
This is a deck.
Brilliant. Deans are good for something after all.
Right.
Faculty, however, are good for very little, so we've learned 2 lessons here. Okay, so here's a graph that shows you the changes in employment among black men between 1960 and 1980, which was the period that the truly disadvantaged concentrated on. And I showed you the changes by age for men who worked no weeks and for men who worked throughout the year, 50 to 52 weeks. I left out the middle group, but you can get those by subtraction, that is. But the thing you will notice about this is that there's a substantial increase in the percentage of men who are not working. That's the first bar of yellow things across all age groups. But not anywhere near as big as the increase in the percentage of children living in single-parent families. And the second thing you'll notice is that there's basically no change in the percentage working steadily throughout the year, which is the kind of the group that we would think would be the most likely to be promising fathers. That is, stability is what people like in life, and steady employment is what people say they want, and I think what most people do want. And those numbers don't change enough to make much difference. So what's going on is that the group that's left out here, which didn't fit on the slide when I made it the first time, which is the people who are employed some of the year but not all of the year, has gotten a little smaller because some of those people are out of the labor force. Some of them are in jail, some of them are homeless, some of them are on the street, working off the books, so forth, but they're not in the regular labor force. Okay, so that's the story about them, but now we want to go down here. So what's the change in, or what's the story with the relationship of those numbers to marriage rates? Well, if you look across, if you look down these things, you see, particularly, if you eliminate the 16 to 19-year-olds who actually played a large role in the original version of this, none of whom are married, essentially, in either period, you can see that working more weeks is associated with being much more likely to be married. This is men, the missing group in the usual studies of this subject, most of which focuses on women. But the men are much more likely to be married if they're working full-time across the year than if they're not working at all. So that's totally consistent with Bill's argument. It's exactly what all of us would expect. It's true, very true. But now look at the declines. Where are the declines coming? Well, the declines are coming among men who are working full-time year-round. Those declines are bigger than the declines in any of the other groups. And if you do the multiplication and work out, well, what fraction of the total decline in marriage among men between the ages of 20 and 44 at least is accounted for by people who are working full through the whole year. It's about more than half of the decline is in that group. So the implication of this, I would say, is pretty clear-cut, which is it's true cross-sectionally that being employed steadily makes a big difference, but it's not true that it accounts for the big change. The big change is almost the same for the people who worked full-time throughout the year as it is for the population as a whole, because the changes in the distribution across those categories were too small to make a big difference. This is a common story. What explains cross-sectional differences doesn't always explain change over time. This is a good illustration of that. It's a problem that can only be solved if you can actually find data that's appropriate for the theory. Now, what would you conclude from this? Well, I would conclude that Bill was still right in one sense. I conclude that because if you come back 20 years later and you look at what we learned after Bill's book was published, it turned out that the changes over the next 20 years fit his model better than the changes between 1960 and 1980. So instead of saying he was wrong about the past, we could say he was right about the future, which is a much more valuable skill, I would say, especially in the social sciences. And so 3 cheers for prescience. I think the truth is, though, that although if you estimate models of what happened over time, you can do pretty well in explaining the trends with the changes in male employment and earnings, the changes in women's employment and earnings, sex ratio, and so forth. You can do almost equally well if you just put a linear time trend in. And anything that moves in more or less a straight line over this period will explain that trend. So in the end, you just have to say social science flunks on the problem of figuring this one out in terms of explaining the trend, because the trend doesn't have properties that make it easy to distinguish one explanation for another. But what on earth you're still left with? What's explaining why the decline among the people who are working regularly? And there you come back to the arguments about soft variables, variables that are hard to measure, culture, all that kind of thing. And I just want to throw out 3 quick things. One is conflict over gender roles. This has been a subject of a lot of work since then. Orlando Patterson has written extensively about conflict within black families and why that's driven down marriage rates. There's lots of quantitative evidence that there was rising conflict about gender roles and attitudes. Second thing is some issues about who's in charge, control, which is really a subset of that. Kathy's work has particularly shaped my thinking about that. People who are unmarried and cohabiting will say, will say, well, I don't want to get married. If I get married, I won't be in charge of this household anymore. He'll be in charge of the household. Well, that's a big disincentive to marriage for people who are deeply suspicious of the opposite sex, and often with reason. So I think I'm going to stop now, but I'm not going to stop before I say once again, I think that Bill has been ahead of the curve on each of these issues, and that we still have a lot of work to do. Come back to the thing.
I'm just going to confess my need for a technician straight out. Yeah, right. Okay. So where were you when you first encountered the truly disadvantaged? We're all telling that story just like we tell the story, where were you when September 11th happened? In many cases, the first question has a happier answer than the second. I was in the basement of the Rebecca Crown Auditorium at Northwestern University. Bill was speaking. It was 1987. I was a first-year graduate student. And, you know, it was life-changing. What Bill did in that book was to cast a bright light on the race-class divide in family life, among so many other things. He focused on the spread of single parenthood, in particular the rise in non-marital childbearing, and caused a generation of researchers to examine the causes and the consequences for parents, kids, communities, and policy. So my job on this panel is to help you think about what can inspire the next generation of young researchers. Will those of you who are students in this audience walk away today just like I walked away 25 years ago in 1987 with their lives changed, with new passion, with new vision, with the new focus on the critical issues of urban poverty that still are with us? In particular, my task is to ask the question, is it still important to shine a bright light on the race-class divide in family life for parents, kids, communities, and policy? And to that question, I'm going to offer the answer, yes. Today, I bring new news about the race-class divide in family life, and I believe it's news that should inspire. Now, much of what Bill did is bring new news. I remember vividly those maps of Chicago and how they were changing over time. I'm going to argue that this new news suggests that we've been going about the study of single parenthood and its causes and its consequences all wrong. Jeannie Brooks-Gunn alluded to what I'm about to say. We've been studying single mothers at the same time in which single mothers have been rapidly disappearing. And in fact, I'm going to show you, I think, that there are no single mothers anymore. And the challenge for the next generation of researchers is to study the complex families that have taken their place. You may wonder, has she lost her mind? But let me show you what I mean. This is a presentation I did in conjunction with Laura Tuck, a graduate of our joint program in social policy and sociology, and Sarah McClanahan from Princeton University. This is from the Fragile Families and Child Well-Being Study, a birth cohort study of 5,000 American children and their parents, both male and female. 4/5 of these families were unmarried at the time of their child's birth, and all of the folks in this analysis were unmarried when their children was born. If you don't know much about the United States, you may not realize, but in the United States, even though single parenthood is now at about 40% of all births are non-marital, a little more than 40% actually, it is still highly selective of disadvantage in the U.S. So I'm going to talk about unstable and complex families. Now, relationship instability starts when parents have a focal child, but then they break up. As Jeannie told you, half of all fragile families are living together when their baby is born. 80% are in a romantic relationship. When that relationship dissolves, we have an instance of family instability. And here's how common family instability is for children born in the year 2000. By the time they've reached 5, 55% have seen a parent break up and that parent take on a new romantic partner. This partner churning is very, very American. We love to break up and we love to get back together. And those of us with children love it as much as those of us who don't have children. You can see that a fairly large portion of children born to unmarried parents are experiencing 3 and 4 relationship transitions, both in and out of a new parental partnership by the time they're 5. Here's the story from mom's point of view. Again, of that 51%, a little over half are experiencing multiple partner transitions. Not only are they breaking up with the focal child's parents, they have 2 or more additional partners. Here's the story from the father's point of view. Again, sorry. Yes, okay. Fathers aren't transitioning quite as quickly as mothers, but we still have a lot of transition on the father's side. Okay. Now, when mothers and fathers repartner, they often go on to have additional children. They also often bring children with them into the relationship. In the Fragile Family Study, for example, about 40% of moms and 40% of dads already had a child with another partner when that focal child was born. But when parents repartner, they can also have additional children. We call this family complexity. How frequent is this? So this is the amount of what researchers are calling multiple partner fertility in fragile families by the child's 5th birthday. As you can see, 60% of children experience this, those born to outside of marriage. For about one in 3 of those, it's 1 additional sibling. But for 2/3 of those in that group, they have multiple half-siblings. Okay? For some, it's the dad only. For some, it's the mom only. And for some, it's both parents. So what happens when we put together family instability with family complexity? That little 4%, if I can get this to work, is why I claim there are no single mothers anymore. We have this group of stable 2-parent families. There are this large number of cohabitors in fragile families, and some of those do stick together and have very, very family-like, fairly stable relationships. But for the majority of children born outside of marriage, and I think this is now 42% of all children, when this survey was first introduced, it was about 35%. Almost 8 in 10 children are experiencing these unstable and complex families. So here's how it breaks down. Some are just unstable. There's no half-sibs. Okay, some are stable, but there are half-sibs because those half-sibs came into the relationship. But for 45% of the total, there's both instability and complexity. And to add to this, what this chart doesn't show is that 18% of these kids get new step-siblings from either the mom's or the dad's current new partner. I should say that all of what I've shown you here is actually an underestimate. These are relationships of at least 3 months duration. And if you were interviewed and your relationship did not overlap with the interview wave, your partner transition was missed. Okay, so these are somewhat of an underestimate. Okay, so this is kind of the picture of the complex family taking into account those half-siblings from parents' new partners. This pattern is historically unique in the U.S. This pattern is also unique among rich nations. Now, if you're like some of my more left-leaning sociological colleagues, you may think this is fantastic. We've embarked on a bold new social experiment. Who knows how it'll turn out? If that's your point of view, fine. It should still inspire you to find out what's going on. Maybe you think this is nothing short of a catastrophe, a morally urgent problem. And in fact, as Ginny pointed out, there is some evidence that all of this transitioning is actually bad, especially for boys. I should point out that we have almost no idea what caused families to become more unstable and more complex. I've just written a book on the topic with Tim Nelson that tries to explain it based on an 8-year ethnographic study of low-income unmarried fathers. I won't tell you what's in the book, but you can read it in February when it comes out. Or like Sandra said, you can at least buy it. Okay, but whatever your view of this new news, Okay, and of course, Bill also brought new news. Okay, I think this is vital new news too. These historically unique trends, distinctive to this rich nation, should inspire. What are the causes of these highly dynamic families, this highly dynamic form of family life concentrated at the bottom of the income distribution? How did we get there? And what are the consequences for parents, kids, communities, and public policy? Thank you.
So I'm hoping in the discussion and question and answer period we can explore some of the policy implications of the things that have been talked about and also were raised in the panels before lunch. And I just want to take a couple of minutes and make a few comments about an issue that obsessed many of us around the time when Bill was writing The Truly Disadvantaged, and Mitt Romney's unfortunate venture into the area notwithstanding, pretty much doesn't get any attention at this point, and that's welfare. In Bill's chapter on family structure in The Truly Disadvantaged, he spent a fair amount of time looking at the claims that were being made with great vehemence at the time that actually it was the welfare system that was driving the family structure changes, that because we had because single parents could be supported by government aid, that meant that they didn't have to get married, and all sorts of dreadful things happened. There was some research at the time, which Bill reviewed and which David and I had done some of, which cast doubt on this hypothesis. As best we could tell at the time, though, nobody believed us, and everyone continued to believe, including, by the way, welfare recipients, who we spent a lot of time talking to at the time, believed that the welfare system was really very bad in terms of disincentives, not only for work, but also for family formation. So, as some of you are old enough to recall, in the mid-1990s, in 1992, Bill Clinton ran for president, and one of the things that he talked the most about was ending welfare as we know it. In 1996, sure enough, as David said, we not only ended welfare as we know it, but we ended welfare. And the numbers are really pretty startling. In 1994, there were 14 million people receiving AFDC. Around the early 2000s, there were 4 million. That's like a big decrease. Nobody had predicted anything of that sort in terms of a decrease in welfare. Many things were going on. The economy was booming. Welfare systems got even meaner than they were. On the good side, the Clinton administration put in place a set of supports for working families, big expansion of the Earned Income Tax Credit, big expansion of child care and so on to support working families. But it was really a very dramatic change in the way assistance was provided to poor families. Now, what's really remarkable is that in the last 5 years, the time of the Great Recession, the welfare rolls, the cash assistance welfare rolls, have not risen. There are still about 4 million people on welfare. And, you know, after welfare reform, certainly Bill Clinton and all the politicians claimed that welfare reform was an enormous success. And actually, for a while, it looked like it was. Because not only did the caseloads go down, but there was a period when poverty rates went down, or at least not up, and certainly a lot more people working and so on. But I think what people didn't realize enough at the time, except for a few of us who resigned, was that in times of real recession, this was not going to be the safety net that we needed. And of course, what happened was that because welfare was block granted, the welfare money went to the states. In the first couple of years, they made out like bandits in what they got. But you know what they did? They started to spend it. And they spent it on many good things, things like childcare. Some states spent it on prison, but they all spent it. They did not put it away for the rainy day when they might have needed it in order to provide cash assistance to needy families. And that's where we are now. And although, as Bill said, certainly the stimulus package contained lots of aid for poor families, when you look now, the amount of cash assistance that's available to poor families has virtually gone away. And so, I mean, I don't have any illusions that there's going to be a big move in the United States to bring back even moderately decent program of cash assistance for families. I guess I would just like to point out how big a change this has been and how we do need to think about the costs to families and children of the kind of instability that people have been talking about in their economic life, in their family life, and so on. And although, yes, think about what can promote opportunities, also need to think about just how we can kind of support people through this time and prevent some of the huge increases in the inequalities that are facing kids as a result of some of the things that we have done. So just wanted to say some of that, and as I say, a topic that was of great interest at the time and perhaps will come again. So with all that, a lot of material here, and obviously none of our panelists talked about everything that they needed to know, everything that you need to know, but we have about 20 minutes actually for questions. So this is like good. Yes.
I have a question for Kathy. It's just so intriguing that to change our view in this way of categories that have been stable for such a long time, but obviously that just don't make sense. Without getting too deeply into it, I just had a question of if you could amplify a little bit more, if anything is coming out from the study, in terms of, I'll give you an example. So if you read, historians might say that if this were 70 years ago and we were looking at immigrant communities in cities, Irish, Italian, et cetera, we might see some kind of complex arrangement as well that would make us have to rethink whether these are nuclear families, though that they might be living in a home. The variable there that we want to take into consideration is spatial proximity. So that a number of families living close to each other operates as a single, not household necessarily, but some kind of network. So is that what we're seeing here in some sense? I want to introduce the spatial angle here. To what degree do you see a lot of these interesting and complex relationships sandwiched in a similar area, like Carol Stack described a long time ago, or is it more complex than that?
I think what's different, I don't think the two examples could be more different, actually. You know, and I'm not an expert on immigrant communities, but, you know, I do teach this class called Urban Social Problems here at Harvard, and I do the old Chicago school stuff when we look at, you know, the Jane Addams area and how diverse it was. And certainly you had parental death and that kind of thing. You had extended family structures and all of that. But the adults in children's lives, other than parental death, were fairly stable, right? What's going on here, and any field worker in the room could tell you this, and most people could just know this by common sense, is that the adults in children's lives are unstable. And, you know, once, if a child's father moves out of the household, the chances that dad will stay involved with that kid over time are really poor. And in his place, you know, we used to think, well, at least some folks used to think, I used to study just mothers, and you know, I thought, well, gee, the moms are doing fine, let's just get these men out of their lives. And What I didn't realize, of course, that was a very naive view, because in the wake of a parental breakup, you have new partnerships. And so kids get exposed to a social father, and then they lose that relationship. And then they get exposed to another social father or a social mother, and they lose those relationships. And their relationships with their half-siblings become attenuated. So this is just a lot for a kid to handle. And it's not like you can just go around the corner and see dad. It's like you may never see dad again. And you may never see that stepfather again. And you may never see that social father again. Or if you do, your relationship is likely to have atrophied. So kids' relationships with adults, except for their mothers, are highly unstable. That's a lot of pressure to put on women.
Bill?
Yes, four very interesting presentations, and provocative, by the way. Now, most of the studies testing out my hypothesis on the relationship between male joblessness and family structure are based on national statistics and highly aggregate statistics. And therefore, the findings have been mixed. Now, Daniel Lichter and his colleagues from Penn State University published a paper in the American Journal of Sociology, and they pointed out that the use of national data is potentially problematic because spatial variation in marriage and family behavior is fairly substantial. So to address this problem, Lichter and his colleagues used local area data from the 1980 public use microdata sample, and they developed measures that represent variations of my Kathy, and my male marriageable pool index, Kathy Neckerman. And their data clearly reinforce the argument that a shortage of economically attractive men in local labor markets depresses female marriage rates using local data. Now, the thing is, Sandy, they use 1980 public use. It's not a longitudinal. It would be interesting to see whether or not your argument, if applied to local inner city neighborhoods, using not cross-sectional data, but longitudinal data, still holds. That would be an interesting study. Now, this relates then to Kathy. Kathy, could you say just a little bit about your sample, and then I have a comment. You used the fragile family sample, right? Say a little bit about that sample.
Should I go first?
Yes, yeah, then I'll respond.
Yeah, so it's an interesting sample. It's not perfect. It is a sample of kids in large cities. They were all born in 2000, and the real magic, as Jeannie said, of the study is that the sampling was done in the hospital. I was part of the team that, it takes
To what extent does the sample really sort of represent inner city neighborhoods? I'm just curious.
To what extent?
Yeah.
There are lots and lots of inner city families.
Precisely.
In the sample.
What you are capturing here with your unique finding are some family variations in the inner city, for the most part. You can't generalize to the entire nation. Again, you have to look at you have to draw comparisons between poor inner city neighborhoods and the nation as a whole. It would be interesting just to see whether or not, if you had a different sample, what kinds of variations would you find?
Yeah, Beltaw Hills made the same criticism. They are weighted to be nationally representative, so I think it's an open question.
Would you?
But we've replicated these findings with other data as well.
Yeah, Kathy, could you and Jeannie maybe speculate on an answer to that question? I guess I'd like to propose One of the things I worry a lot about, and I know other people do too, is the growing differences between rich kids and poor kids in the kinds of situations they are in and the kinds of opportunities they have, and that those differences between rich and poor kids, at least on a lot of dimensions, are getting greater. Would it be your hypothesis that this is really different for rich families and that it's becoming more different?
There's no doubt about it.
Okay.
In fact, marriages in the middle class among college-educated students are more stable.
Yeah.
They've grown more stable since 1980. So even if this sample is only representative of kids in large cities, and we have other data sources that tell a similar story, it's really the divergence between
okay.
middle America and the picture that I showed you that's of concern.
Jeannie, do you want to comment on that? And then we'll go back to Bill's other question. It's coming.
Okay, great.
Let me remind people to identify themselves. Bill Wilson, I think we can all identify, but please identify yourself when you
Jeannie
speak.
Brooks Gunn. The data, we have lots of inner city, highly concentrated poor neighborhoods, but not all of the families are in those types of neighborhoods in our 20 cities. So to answer Bill's question more specifically, I don't think this pattern that we're seeing is necessarily specific to highly concentrated poor neighborhoods, i.e. those with 40% or more. I think it is specific to urban neighborhoods, many of which would be 20% or more poverty. And I'd also like to say that when you disaggregate by ethnicity, the patterns that we're seeing, as long as you're looking at the unmarrieds, as Kathy is looking at, are very similar for blacks and whites. Not clear for Hispanics. There may be a little less instability for the Hispanics, although I haven't really looked at that. But in terms of, is it just highly concentrated neighborhoods where we're seeing this? My answer would be no. But it is totally class and
Okay, well,
education of
that's
Mother Link. Mary Jo is
Huge.
right on the money, totally different picture.
But it is a sample of people the children were born when the parents were unmarried. Is that
Correct.
right? So everybody in your sample is that, so that's,
In these charts.
yeah.
But we have, a quarter are married, so we have a comparison group, and you can look at the transitions in those groups, which are certainly less than what Kathy's showing you, but there still is a relatively high breakup of families by the time the kids are 5 and 9, of the marrieds.
Sandy, do you want to comment on Bill's question to you, or if you've remembered it?
I think, I don't know the answer, so I think I won't comment.
Okay.
I
Bill,
could do that at great length, but that isn't
I'm sure
really-
you would, yeah. Bill, you said you wanted to come back with it.
I just wanted to be clear
Yeah.
what Kathy was talking about, the nature of the sample, the extent to which that sample is representative of the country or inner city neighborhoods or poor people. So you've answered.
can I just add something very quickly? First, given his facts, it would be very hard for it to be true, not true regionally, and certainly some of my and others' early work did try and use the variations across regions because that's less sensitive to individuals. But I would also say, it seems to me that's precisely what Kathy's is so important about. We don't really know how this pattern varies and so on. It feels, and there's some evidence that it's increasing bifurcation. And so if this means that children's lives are even more different than we think, it's not just poverty, but across the spectrum, and we know it's very different in terms of patterns of marriage and childbearing and so forth, that has really profound implications in lots of different ways. But we're not quite sure what those are, so this is why it's a great thing for this audience.
I think also one of the things that's implicit in Kathy's pictures is that maybe we're thinking about the wrong measure of what the problem is.
Right.
That is, there's some evidence elsewhere too that if you actually have a stable single mother from age 0 to age 18, that's not so bad. But mostly you don't. And that it may well be that it's the numbers of transitions and the degree of complexity that we should be worrying about and not having a child out of wedlock.
Well, I was struck by that in Jeannie's presentation. I mean, it just seemed to me these are, question in the back. Please identify yourself.
Connie Williams.
my question relates very much to Kathy's and Jeannie's presentation. Your description of the children and their experience with, say, serial fathers or father figures, it leads me to wonder if we pay enough attention to emotional indicators. We tend to emphasize a lot, at least when we're talking politically and in social policy, the economic stability and cash assistance and food stamps and those things. But what does it mean for children when they don't have the lasting emotional stability, and then to turn the picture around? Often single mothers, particularly teen mothers whom I studied, often felt that their dependable emotional ties were to their children, not to men whom they would want in and out of their lives, but they felt that from the time the child was born. And I can't help but wonder, as you go down the line, what does this mean for how they might develop in terms of their work patterns, how they would relate to those sorts of things. And we may not be able to see that far ahead, but I certainly think it's worth thinking about how those emotional issues relate to that development, and instead of thinking as much as we often do in the political arena of just what's happening with cash assistance, food stamps, economics.
Well, I can tell you one little bit, and then I think Jeannie will probably want to say something. So two things come to mind. One is that in the few studies that Fragile Families has done, the kids have not been old enough to look at all of this yet. It seems that what's really going on is that when mom enters into these new partnerships, her capacity to parent is diminished. So it seems like the pathway is through parenting. But I do want to just tell you one little story. It's kind of an extreme story in a way, so I'm hesitant kind of to tell it, but it kind of shows you what this might feel like from the point of view of a kid. So Andre Green, who is kind of one of the main characters in this book that'll come out in February, really sweet kid. He's the kind of kid who stays in school and does the right thing, and in fact, he's kind of commented upon for being a good kid. He does have a kid outside of marriage. In fact, he conceives this kid when he's 14 in a very short-term relationship. Doesn't even know the girl's pregnant until after the baby's born, or just before the baby's born. And he just cottons on to fatherhood like nothing you've ever seen. And in fact, I just ran into him again this summer, and he is still deeply connected to this child, and in fact, mostly ended up raising her because the mother had a drug addiction. And he tells this story of getting, he lives with his mom and doesn't really know his dad, and he lives with his stepdad and a couple step siblings and a bio brother. And he and his bio brother are called into the schoolyard, or having a fight in the schoolyard with two other boys, and the principal calls him in, and she calls the only adult on the emergency contact form that will answer the phone, and this woman comes in, and this is Andre's grandma, they call. And so Andre's there, and his brother's there, and these two other kids are there, and this woman comes into the room, and the other two boys say, "Grandma." So this is how he discovers two siblings, and he meets two other siblings by chance in the neighborhood as well. So for a kid to not know who his siblings are seems, that it just really struck me. And in fact, it struck him. He says, I'm not going to be that guy. I'm not going to be that guy. And so he's trying to turn it around, fighting unbelievable odds in his own life, in his own family life.
There was a question in the back, and then we'll come to Bruce.
My name is David Williams. I have a question for Mary Jo, but any of the other panelists could also respond. You said something quite striking, and that was that in the last 5 years, the welfare rolls have not risen, in spite of the very difficult economic times. Do we have any sense of what is going on? Is it that people have reached a 5-year limit? Is that people are not applying? Is it that people feel welfare is so stigmatized? I mean, what's driving it? And to what extent, given that welfare is now a block grant, is there state-to-state variation in this overall pattern?
I mean, I think my answer would be all of the above, and other people can comment. I'd like to focus, though, on the fact that it is a block grant. And that the fact that it is a block grant means that it is under control of the states. And, you know, we have noticed that it is actually at the state level over the last period during the recession where terrific number of cuts have been made because states have to balance their budget. Turns out their revenues are down. If you balance your budget, that means your expenses have to go down. The block grant is part of that. And, you know, all the rules about this is only for these kinds of uses notwithstanding, money's fungible. And when states have that amount of money, they've devoted it to certain purposes and they can't spend it on anything else. So that's that. And then that gets communicated down to the potential recipients of welfare and to the welfare offices. And it's just, you know, it is not anymore kind of part of what people do. David, you probably want to comment.
And then Kathy should say something too. Just quickly, so first of all, I really do think the block grant is the point. States really are in terrible, terrible economic shape, and this is a flexible spending account. And so, yeah, they figure out various ways to go. Kathy can tell us a little bit about what it's like for recipients and whether they're even interested in applying. It does vary a lot state to state. But there's one other message that's really important here. Food stamps is way up. I have some charts where I just sort of show the cyclicality of the old AFTC and now TANF program. It sort of followed cyclically until after TANF, and then it just splits apart. You know, this keeps going down even though the economy goes bad. But food stamps, if anything, is more cyclical than it used to be, partly because a lot of expansion, including during the various things in the stimulus bill and so forth, included expansions in food stamps. So food stamps are clearly vastly more important than replaced welfare. The only other thing to remember for those of us that study this and so forth, welfare was never the sole or even primary means of support. It was one means of support. And for those of us involved in welfare reform, one little secret is we worked really hard to make sure we only reformed AFTC so that it would make, you know, this would be one element and this would maybe be more focused on work, but with a recognition that there were many other outcomes. Obviously, the block grant outcome was a part that's bad. And the reason I want to mention that is it is seriously talked about in Washington in this budgetary environment that you should block grant food stamps. And the arguments presumably will be the same. There are very compelling arguments. We were present when there was a meeting with a variety of governors and the president and others, President Clinton this was, and they basically said, let me get this straight. You know better what's right for poor people in my state than I do. Why is it you bureaucrats in Washington, many of whom have never even been in a poor neighborhood, which by the way turns out to be true, know better the best way to help poor folks than I do, or than we do. You care more about poor people than we do. And it's a really hard argument to counter, at least it was then. This time it ought to be a little easier, but most importantly, it turns out that they may care just as much, but when they're in extreme, they also have balanced budget requirements and extreme fiscal pressures and everything you see at the federal government. And so even if they'd like to do something, and by the way, when it first started, they actually did better in many, many states than the federal government had done in terms of supporting and focusing on work. So all I can just say is I'm particularly in a position where I try not to get involved in political issues, but on this one I would. It's just enormously important that food stamp not get block granted. I mean, that is the last of the real safety net. The housing programs, who knows, but the food stamps is the last best hope. And by the way, the politics are way better. There's farmers involved, it's not cash, and so on. So I'm sorry for the one political announcement, but just very important.
Quick comment from Kathy and then Bruce, and then we're going to wrap up.
I want to just capitalize on the food stamp comment. I spent the summer working for the USDA. We did about 100 in-depth interviews with food stamp households across the country as a part of a 5,000-person survey. Quite a depressing summer. There are, I think, 43 million
43
Americans on food stamps, and wow, they really need the money. A quarter of them have no cash income other than food stamps. And many of those folks still will not go to TANF. The other thing I did this summer is I was following ethnographically, my first foray into true ethnographic work, 5 families with no cash income. And I asked one, why not TANF? And she said, well, I've been rejected for 20 jobs a month on average. Do you really think I can afford another rejection? The other thing I will say is that just as in the old days when when welfare recipients were treated like crap at the welfare office, so are food stamp recipients. We have reports from all across the country of the stigmatizing treatment poor folks receive when they try to get food for their kids, not cash, but just food.
Bruce?
Bruce Weston. An implication people might draw from the panel discussion is that we should expect to see declining intergenerational mobility. But the evidence for that so far is very mixed at best. So I was wondering if the panel could help us explain why. Are the trends that we're pointing to in family dynamics too new to be fully played out yet? When would we might expect to observe reduced mobility, and where would we expect to observe it?
What kind of mobility are you thinking of? Income, occupation, education, all of the above? I mean, they're different stories is where I'm going.
So certainly income mobility, there doesn't appear to be strong cohort differences or strong cohort trends in income mobility by the time people are in their early 30s through, say, 2010.
I think that's correct. We don't, but if you think about that, then if you go back and say, well, when were those people born? By definition, they had to be born by 1980 or before in order to be 30 by 2010. So many of the things that have happened in the last 30 years didn't kick in until they were teenagers or young adults or something. So it's perfectly possible that things will show up over the next 25 years that we haven't seen yet, given this just a very long lag in that. You get a more up-to-date picture if you look at educational stuff, and there the picture is a little different. We see a rising correlation between parental income and kids' test scores. We don't understand why that is. And we don't see that much change in the effect of parental income on educational attainment, but there appears to be some increase in that effect, and at least some data sets show it and some don't, but I think.
Bob Putnam, I don't know if you've seen his work recently and so forth, but he's totally preoccupied with this question, and his assertion is precisely the, I guess, extreme version of what Sandy said. Essentially, most of the things that have changed since 1980, and of course, remember, we're not mostly looking at kids born in 1980, we're mostly looking at kids born before 1980. So, and he has a lot of other measures ranging from parental involvement in schools to sports activity, to lots of things, all of which individually you'd say, who cares, or I can tell a lot of stories, but he weaves it together in a fairly compelling story, and his assertion is, look, we can't wait for, the people like the folks, at least the two of us or somebody around this table that would spend forever looking at the data before being willing to claim anything, because it's happening fast, and the implications are huge. And I guess the only other part of this is the other thing that is really dramatic that's going on is demographic change in this country, and it just is, the classic non-Hispanic white stereotypical image is just increasingly not true in many of our states, and it won't be true in the entire country very soon. And so to the extent that we have different kinds of families and different kinds of opportunities and so forth, so I think there's very good reason to be fearful, but There's also reason, it is sort of surprising that it's harder to find this stuff than you might think. You can find studies that show it, but you can also find equally good studies or better that don't.
Okay, we're going to wrap up. Bruce is allowing us 10 minutes for a break. Okay, so the next panel will start at 1. Do whatever you have to do quickly.